January 13, 2002. A family of 6, a father, a mother, and 4 young children, lived and worked on a remote cattle ranch in Argentina's Entre Ríos province, a landscape of endless grass and isolation, where neighbors were measured in kilometers, not meters. By nightfall that day, they had vanished. Not just the father, not just the mother, all 6 of them, gone from a place they had no vehicle to leave, gone without collecting a paycheck that was owed, gone leaving behind money, documents, and the entire architecture of their lives. For 3 months, no one noticed. When family members finally made inquiries, they were told the Gills had been given an unprecedented vacation, 3 months off from their caretaker duties on the La Candelaria estate. 3 months that the landlord claimed he'd generously granted them to seek better opportunities elsewhere. But relatives knew better. The Gills had never been given more than 15 days off at a time. They had no means of transportation. Margarita Gill was owed her latest salary from her job at the local school. And most damningly, they had abandoned everything: their furniture, their belongings, their identification documents, and their livestock in the small house where they'd lived on the sprawling property. When authorities finally began searching the ranch, they found traces of blood in the soil, mattresses that had been burned, and a landlord whose story kept changing. This is not a story about one person disappearing. This is the story of an entire family erased from existence. A mother, a father, and 4 children whose fate remains unknown more than 2 decades later. Among them was young Mariana Gill, just 2 years old, who vanished alongside her siblings, 9-year-old Miguel Angel, 7-year-old Jose Ruben, and 4-year-old Melissa. What happened on that remote Argentine ranch, and how do 6 human beings simply cease to exist? The Gill family. Ruben Jose Gill was 56 years old in 2002, a man whose life had been defined by physical labor and rural work. He had spent decades in Argentina's countryside, moving between farms and ranches, taking whatever work was available for a man with strong hands and a willingness to endure the isolation that came with caretaking positions on massive rural properties. Those who knew Ruben described him as gregarious and talkative, a man who, despite limited education and modest means, possessed an easy social manner. He was the type to strike up conversations, to laugh readily, to make friends among fellow workers and townspeople during his infrequent trips into Vial, the small town nearest to the ranch where he worked. But Ruben was also a man caught in Argentina's brutal economic realities. The country was in the midst of a devastating financial crisis. In December 2001, just weeks before the Gill family disappeared, Argentina had defaulted on its debt, triggering bank runs, riots, and the resignation of President Fernando de la Rúa. The peso, which had been pegged to the dollar, collapsed. Savings vanished overnight. Unemployment soared. For people like Ruben, rural workers without savings, without property, without safety nets, the crisis meant something even more fundamental: the constant pressure to accept whatever work was offered, however exploitative the terms. His wife, Margarita Norma Gallegos, was just 26 years old, 30 years younger than her husband. The age gap was significant but not unusual in rural Argentina, where economic vulnerability often shaped relationship dynamics. Margarita had grown up in poverty, and marriage to Ruben, despite his own precarious circumstances, represented a form of stability. Margarita worked 2 jobs. She helped Ruben with caretaking duties on the La Candelaria estate, feeding livestock, maintaining fences, keeping watch over the property. But she also worked at the local school in Viale, a position that provided a small but crucial additional income. Those who knew her described Margarita as hardworking and devoted to her children. She was quiet, practical, focused on the daily work of keeping her family fed and housed in circumstances that left little room for ambition or dreams beyond survival. Together, Ruben and Margarita had 4 children. Miguel Angel, the oldest at 9 years old, was already helping his parents with ranch work, feeding animals, collecting eggs, doing the small tasks that rural children learn early. He attended school in Viale when he could, though attendance was irregular, disrupted by the family's work obligations and the distance from the ranch to town. Jose Ruben, 7 years old, was named after his father. He was described as energetic and curious, a child who asked constant questions about how things worked. Like his older brother, he was beginning to take on responsibilities around the property. Melissa, 4 years old, was at the age where the world is still mostly wonder. She had not yet started formal schooling. Her days were spent near her mother, playing in the yard of the small house the family occupied on the estate, watching the rhythms of ranch life unfold around her. And then there was Mariana, the baby, just 2 years old, too young to remember any of what happened, too young to understand that the life her family had built, however modest and precarious, was about to end. The world they lived in, Entre Ríos province, sits in northeastern Argentina, a region of cattle ranches, agricultural land, and small towns connected by long stretches of rural highway. The province is bracketed by 2 major rivers, the Paraná to the west and the Uruguay to the east, and its interior is characterized by rolling grasslands, wetlands, and vast properties dedicated to cattle and farming. La Candelaria estate, where the Gill family lived and worked, was located in an area called Crucecitas Septimas, roughly 50 kilometers from Paraná, the provincial capital. The property sprawled across approximately 500 hectares, more than 1,200 acres of grassland, scattered outbuildings, and a main house where the owner Alfonso Goat maintained control of operations. Estates like La Candelaria operate on a model that has defined Argentine rural life for generations. Absentee owners who employ caretakers to live on the property year-round, maintaining fences, managing livestock, and serving as the owner's eyes and hands on the land. The caretakers, families like the Gills, are typically paid modest wages, provided with basic housing, and expected to be available at all times. It's a relationship built on profound power imbalance. The caretaker depends entirely on the owner for housing, income, and in many cases, access to the outside world. The owner, meanwhile, has near total control over the lives of the people who work for them, especially on remote properties where oversight is minimal and labor protections are difficult to enforce. By January 2002, Argentina was experiencing its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The financial collapse that began in late 2001 had triggered massive unemployment, widespread poverty, and social unrest. In Buenos Aires and other cities, people banged pots and pans in protest, demanding government action. Banks froze accounts. ATMs ran out of cash. But in rural Entre Ríos, the crisis manifested differently. For families like the Gills, it meant even less bargaining power, even fewer options. Ranch owners, themselves squeezed by economic conditions, cut costs wherever possible, reducing staff, lowering wages, delaying payments. Ruben and Margarita Gill were trapped in a system where leaving meant losing not just employment, but also their home, and in the midst of a national economic catastrophe, finding alternative work was nearly impossible. This context, economic desperation, geographic isolation, and extreme power imbalance, is crucial to understanding what happened next. The days before, in early January 2002, witnesses would later report that Ruben Gill's demeanor had changed. The man who was typically sociable and upbeat had become withdrawn. He appeared preoccupied, even worried. A psychological autopsy conducted years later would confirm these observations. Several people who encountered Ruben in the days before January 13th described him as silent, thoughtful, and very concerned, a stark departure from his normal personality. What was weighing on him? We don't know with certainty. But there are clues. Margarita had not received her most recent salary from the school where she worked. In the midst of Argentina's economic crisis, delayed wages were common, but for a family living paycheck to paycheck, even a short delay created immediate hardship. There's also evidence that tensions existed between Ruben and Alfonso Goit, the estate owner. Multiple sources would later describe the relationship as strained. Goet was known to be demanding and, according to some accounts, difficult to work for. Ruben, meanwhile, had limited options and knew it. Some investigators have theorized that Ruben may have been contemplating leaving La Candelaria, perhaps looking for work elsewhere, or planning to move the family to a place with more opportunities. But rural workers in Argentina don't simply quit jobs that provide housing. Leaving would have required having somewhere else to go, some other source of income lined up. And in January 2002, in the midst of economic collapse, such alternatives were scarce. Whatever was troubling Ruben remained unspoken, or at least unreported to authorities. On January 12, 2002, the family traveled to the nearby town of Viale. This in itself was not unusual. Trips to town for supplies, for errands, for brief escapes from the isolation of ranch life were a normal part of their routine. That evening, they visited the home of a friend named Maximo Vega. It was a social call, the kind of ordinary interaction that defines small-town life. They talked. They visited. And then, as night fell, the Gill family left Vega's house to return to La Candelaria. This was the last confirmed sighting of all 6 members of the family together and alive. January 13, 2002. What happened in the hours and days after the Gill family returned from VIA remains one of the most disputed and mysterious aspects of this case. According to the owner Alfonso Goetz's later statements, he last saw the family on January 13th. He claimed that he informed them they were being given 3 months vacation, an unprecedented length of time off, so they could travel to Santa Fe province to look for work or visit relatives. But this account is immediately problematic. First, as family members would later point out, Goet had never given the Gills more than 10 to 15 days off at a time in all the years they'd worked for him. A 3-month vacation was completely out of character. Second, if the family was planning to leave for 3 months, why would they leave behind all their possessions? Their furniture, their clothes, their identification documents, their money. All of it remained in the house. Margarita never collected her outstanding salary from the school. They made no arrangements for mail forwarding or for anyone to watch over their belongings. Third, the Gills had no vehicle. To travel to Santa Fe or anywhere else, they would have needed to arrange for transportation. But there's no evidence of them hiring a car, catching a bus, or making any preparations for departure. The morning of January 13th, a neighbor claimed to have seen the family near the ranch. This sighting has never been definitively confirmed, but if accurate, it places them on the property in the daylight hours. And then, according to police investigation files, phone records show that calls were made from Ruben Gill's cell phone on January 13th. The calls were placed to a number registered to a woman in Rosario, a major city several hours away. Investigators were never able to identify or locate this woman. Even more mysteriously, Ruben's cell phone remained active, making and receiving calls, until April 2003, 15 months after the family disappeared. Who was using the phone? Where was it? These questions have never been answered. One neighbor, a man surnamed Villanueva, later told police that he saw Ruben on horseback on the property on January 14th, the day after the family supposedly left on vacation. This sighting, if accurate, would suggest that Ruben was still on the ranch at least 24 hours after Goet claimed the family had departed. But the sighting couldn't be verified, and it raises more questions than it answers. If Ruben was still there on January 14th, where was the rest of his family? When silence became suspicion, for 3 months no one questioned the Gill family's absence. This might seem extraordinary from an outside perspective, but in the context of rural Argentina in 2002, it's more understandable. The Gills lived on an isolated property. They had limited contact with extended family members, most of whom lived elsewhere in Entre Ríos or in other provinces. Phone service was unreliable. Cell phone ownership was far from universal. Moreover, the family's pattern of life didn't include regular check-ins. Ruben's sister, Luisa Eva Gill, and Margarita's mother, Adelia, were used to long stretches without hearing from their relatives. Rural isolation and the demands of caretaker work meant that communication was sporadic at best. It wasn't until April 2002, nearly 3 months after January 13th, that alarm bells finally began to ring. Concerned that they hadn't heard from the family, relatives reached out to Alfonso Goet, asking about the Gills' whereabouts. It was then that Goet delivered his explanation. The family had been given a 3-month vacation and had left to seek work or visit relatives in Santa Fe. But when relatives pressed for details, where exactly in Santa Fe? Which relatives? How had the family traveled? Goet's answers were vague and unsatisfying. Luisa Gill, Ruben's sister, went to VIA police station on April 24, 2002, and filed an official missing persons report. The case was assigned to Judge Jorge Sebastián Galino in the nearby city of Nagoya. By the time police began investigating, the trail was already cold. 3 months had passed. Whatever had happened to the Gill family had happened in January, and it was now late April. The investigation begins. The initial police response was hampered by several factors. First, there was the matter of jurisdiction and resources. Viale is a small town. The local police force had limited investigative capacity, and cases involving potential foul play in rural areas often languished due to lack of personnel, funding, and expertise. Second, there was the economic and political chaos consuming Argentina in 2002. The country was still reeling from the December 2001 crisis. Government institutions were in disarray. Police departments were understaffed and underfunded. Social services were overwhelmed. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the La Candelaria estate was private property. Conducting searches, questioning witnesses, and gathering evidence required cooperation from Alfonso Goyet or legal authorization to override his objections. In the initial months of the investigation, that cooperation was limited. Nevertheless, investigators began piecing together what they could. They interviewed neighbors and other workers who lived on or near the estate. They contacted friends and family members of the Gills, trying to establish whether anyone had heard from them since January. They checked hospitals, morgues, and police records across Entre, Ríos, and neighboring provinces, searching for any trace of the family. They found nothing. The Gills had not shown up at hospitals. They had not been arrested. They had not registered for social services or enrolled their children in schools elsewhere in Argentina. There were no financial transactions, no use of identification documents, no employment records. It was as if 6 people had simply dissolved into air. Investigators focused their attention on Alfonso Goyet. His story didn't add up, and his behavior raised suspicions. When family members of the Gills finally gained access to the house where the family had lived, they made disturbing discoveries. Goyet had claimed the family left all their possessions behind, but when relatives arrived, most of those belongings were gone. Even more troubling, the mattresses the family had slept on had been burned. Goet's explanation was that the mattresses had become stained and unsanitary, so he'd disposed of them. But burning mattresses is not normal behavior for a landlord after tenants leave. And the timing was suspicious. Why had Goet waited 3 months to inform relatives? Why had he destroyed potential evidence before police could examine it? Family members also pointed out inconsistencies in Goet's account. He claimed he'd granted the family a generous 3-month vacation. But workers on the estate told police that Goet was a demanding, controlling employer who rarely allowed time off, and certainly had never given anyone 3 months. Despite these red flags, police lacked concrete evidence to charge Goet with any crime. There were no bodies, no witnesses to violence, no forensic proof that anything criminal had occurred. The investigation stalled. 2003. 2008 years of silence. For years, the Gill family case remained nominally open but largely dormant. Judge Galino ordered periodic reviews, but without new leads or evidence, there was little to investigate. Family members, particularly Luisa Gill and Margarita's mother Adelia, never stopped asking questions. They contacted media outlets, trying to generate publicity for the case. They pressured police to keep searching. They held out hope that somehow, somewhere, the family was alive. But as months turned into years, that hope dimmed. In 2006, the family's lawyer Elvio Garzón made a startling claim. He alleged that police officers had been involved in the Gill family's disappearance. Specifically, officers who had also worked in areas where other mysterious disappearances had occurred, including those of accountant Amado Abib and architect Mario Zapegno. Garzón's theory suggested that corrupt police might have been running some kind of criminal operation, perhaps land theft, extortion, or worse, and that the Gills had become victims of it. But this theory was never formally investigated. It wasn't even recorded in the official case file. Whether this was due to lack of evidence, institutional resistance, or fear of implicating law enforcement, we don't know. Then, in 2008, something changed. Police suddenly conducted a major raid on the La Candelaria estate, the 2008 search. In 2008, 6 years after the family disappeared, investigators descended on La Candelaria with search warrants, cadaver dogs, forensic equipment, and excavation tools. They pulled up floorboards in the house where the Gills had lived. They dug out wells, they searched outbuildings and scoured the surrounding fields, and they found blood. Using luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood even after attempts to clean it, investigators identified 3 areas where human blood had been present. Samples were collected and sent for analysis. The results were both promising and frustrating. The blood was indeed human, but genetic testing showed it did not match the DNA profiles of any of the Gill family members. Forensic experts cautioned that the samples had degraded over 6 years. It was possible, perhaps even likely, that contamination had occurred, making accurate DNA analysis impossible. But they couldn't definitively say whether the contamination was accidental or deliberate. Investigators also noted something unsettling: the presence of blowflies in areas where blood traces were found. Blowflies are attracted to decomposing human remains. Their presence suggested that, at some point, corpses had been in those locations. Searchers used ground-penetrating radar and echo sounders to look for signs of disturbed soil, evidence that graves might have been dug. They found nothing conclusive. The basement of the main house became a particular focus. Family members insisted it should be excavated, claiming that Goethe had filled it in and built over it after the family disappeared. But without definitive evidence to support this claim, and with Goethe refusing permission for major structural investigation of his property, this line of inquiry went nowhere. A well on the property was also searched. Investigators lowered cameras and probes into the dark shaft, looking for remains. They found animal bones, but nothing human. The psychological autopsy, also in 2008. Forensic psychologists conducted what's known as a psychological autopsy of the Gill family, an investigative technique that attempts to reconstruct the mental state and motivations of people who have died or disappeared. Based on interviews with family, friends, and acquaintances, the psychologists reached several conclusions. First, there was no evidence that Ruben or Margarita had psychological or religious motivations that would lead them to sever ties with loved ones and vanish voluntarily. The family had no history of mental illness, no involvement with cults or extremist groups, no indication of suicidal ideation. Second, despite their isolation and economic struggles, Ruben was characterized as fundamentally content. He was described as a happy, loquacious, sociable man who never looked sad. But, and this is crucial, witnesses reported that in the days immediately before the disappearance, Ruben's demeanor had changed dramatically. He became silent, thoughtful, and very concerned. This shift suggests that something specific happened in early January 2002. Some event, confrontation, or realization that altered Ruben's emotional state and possibly precipitated whatever came next. The psychological autopsy concluded that voluntary disappearance was extremely unlikely. The family had no motive to vanish, no preparations in place, and no history of behavior that would make such an act plausible. 2011. Searching the well. In November 2011, nearly a decade after the disappearance, another major search operation focused on a well in the countryside where the family had resided. This time, investigators used more advanced equipment, including underwater cameras and sonar. They found nothing. Over the years, authorities also investigated leads in different Argentine provinces, as well as in Paraguay and Brazil. There were occasional reports of sightings, people who claimed to have seen a family matching the Gills' description, but every lead evaporated upon investigation. The family had not appeared in any registry, neither labor, immigration, educational, nor social security. In 2010, an anomaly briefly raised hopes when the Gills' names appeared on enrollment for Universal Allocation per Child, a government assistance program. But this turned out to be a bureaucratic error, not evidence that the family was alive and accessing benefits. 2015. New investigators, new hope. In 2015, the case was transferred to a new judge, Gustavo Acosta, and prosecutor Federico Uriburu. They represented a fresh set of eyes and a renewed commitment to solving the mystery. Uriburu made a public statement outlining his goals: to give the case more prominence, to involve additional police officers, and to pursue new investigative avenues. One focus was the Cordoban town of Porteña, a community of about 5,000 inhabitants where rural workers from Entre Ríos had reportedly migrated. Investigators theorized that the Gill family might have relocated there, either voluntarily or under duress. But searches and inquiries in Porteña yielded nothing. In August 2015, investigators deployed drones to photograph La Candelaria and surrounding fields from the air. They were looking for signs of disturbed soil areas where the earth had been dug up and refilled, potentially indicating burial sites. They also attempted to obtain aerial photographs of the area from 2002, hoping to compare them with current images and identify changes to the landscape. But comprehensive historical aerial photography of rural Entre Ríos from that period simply didn't exist. Alfonso Goet's death. On June 16, 2016, Alfonso Goet died in a car crash. He was 78 years old. For investigators and the Gill family's relatives, Goet's death represented a devastating loss of potential information. If Goet had been involved in the family's disappearance, either directly or through knowledge of what happened, that information died with him. Family members reacted with grief and frustration. Many believed Goet knew exactly what had happened to the Gills. Some suspected he had orchestrated their deaths, Others thought he might have witnessed something he chose to keep secret. Now, none of those questions would ever be answered. Goet took his secrets, whatever they were, to his grave. Theories and possibilities. More than 2 decades after the Gill family vanished, investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths have proposed numerous theories about what happened. None has been proven. All have significant problems. Theory 1. Voluntary disappearance. Could the Gill family have chosen to leave their old life behind and start fresh elsewhere? On the surface, it's theoretically possible. Argentina, in early 2002, was in chaos. People were desperate. Families were fragmenting under economic pressure. Perhaps Ruben and Margarita decided to cut ties with everyone they knew and build new lives under assumed names. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. The family left behind everything they owned. They had no vehicle, no savings, no means of supporting 6 people during a transition. Margarita's uncollected salary from the school was money they desperately needed. Moreover, 23 years have passed. No one has seen or heard from any member of the family. They've never accessed social services, enrolled children in schools, sought medical care, or done any of the 1,000 things families must do to survive. And perhaps most damning, the family's complete absence from all Argentine government and financial systems suggests they either left the country entirely, which would have required passports and resources they didn't have, or they're dead. Theory 2. They left for work and met foul play elsewhere. Perhaps Goet's story contains a grain of truth. Maybe the family did attempt to leave Entre Ríos, seeking work or visiting relatives. And maybe, along the way, they encountered violence, criminals, traffickers, or someone else with malicious intent. This would explain why they disappeared without a trace from La Candelaria. They might have actually departed the ranch, only to meet disaster elsewhere. But this theory also has problems. How did they leave? They had no vehicle. Bus travel with 4 small children would be memorable to drivers and fellow passengers, yet no one has reported seeing them. And if they met foul play in another location, why has there been no evidence? No bodies discovered, no belongings found, no witnesses to violence. Theory 3. Conflict with Goet. The theory that generates the most suspicion focuses on Alfonso Goet. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Goet's story about granting a 3-month vacation was inconsistent with his past behavior. He waited 3 months before informing family members the Gills were gone. He burned the mattresses. He gave evasive answers when questioned. And when relatives visited the house, belongings Goet claimed were left behind had vanished. Perhaps Ruben and Goet had a confrontation. Perhaps Ruben demanded back wages, or threatened to report Goet for labor violations, or simply gave notice that the family was leaving. And perhaps Goet, in anger or panic or cold calculation, killed the family and disposed of their bodies. The presence of blood traces on the property, the blowflies, and the mysterious phone activity all point to something violent having occurred. But where are the bodies? La Candelaria is a large property, but it's been searched multiple times. Ground-penetrating radar found no evidence of graves. Wells have been examined. Surrounding fields have been scoured. Could Goet have dismembered the bodies and scattered them, burned them, transported them off the property for burial elsewhere? All of these scenarios are possible but would require substantial effort, time, and resources, especially for a man acting alone. Theory 4. Police involvement. Lawyer Elvio Garzón's claim that corrupt police were involved in the disappearance has never been properly investigated, but it can't be dismissed entirely. Argentina has a history of police corruption, particularly in rural areas where oversight is minimal. If officers were involved in criminal enterprises, land theft, extortion, drug trafficking, they would have the means and knowledge to make people disappear effectively. This would explain the thoroughness of the disappearance. It would explain how 6 people could vanish without witnesses. And it might explain why certain investigative leads were never pursued. But without evidence, it remains speculation. Theory 5. Unknown third parties. Could the Gill family have been victims of criminals unrelated to Goet or local police? Rural Argentina in 2002 was not immune to crime. Kidnappings, robberies, and violent attacks occurred. Perhaps someone targeted the isolated family, either randomly or believing they had valuables worth stealing.